Lara Logan is a distinguished journalist with a storied career that has taken her to the front lines of history. Born in Durban, South Africa in 1971, Logan's fearless pursuit of truth and dedication to uncovering stories has made her a prominent figure in the world of journalism. She began her career in the late 1990s, quickly gaining recognition for her willingness to report from the world's most dangerous hotspots. Logan's tenure as a CBS News correspondent, including her role as a correspondent for 60 Minutes, showcased her remarkable ability to deliver in-depth reports from the battlefield, political arenas, and beyond. Her work has not only earned her a place at the forefront of investigative journalism, but has also been recognized with numerous awards, including Emmys, a Murrow Award, and an Overseas Press Club Award. Logan's reports have illuminated the complexities of global events, from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to the 2011 Arab Spring, often at great personal risk. Beyond her contributions to journalism, Logan is celebrated for her unwavering commitment to the truth and her ability to give voice to the voiceless. Her legacy is defined by her courage, resilience, and an unrelenting quest to inform the world about the stories that matter most.
Mentality, I gotta stand and fight for my honor and my family. That's how I did it, cause you know that's how it had to be. So now I'm slaying dragons and I do it happily. I told them I refuse to be another casualty. I looked inside the dragon's eyes and then I told them casually, hi, I'm a dragon slayer and I got a dragon lair. I'ma go and slay a dragon, then I'm gonna drag him there. I don't care, I ain't scared. Look inside my heart and there's a lion there. Conquering my dragons, I ain't fighting fair.
Lara, it's great to be with you. You know, you have been busy getting a lot of work done. You've been the type of person who's always making an impact. You know, your introduction is a great introduction, but there's more to it. And we were talking kind of offline about this, but your career has been very filled. Why don't you fill in some of the blanks? Yeah, people know you from 60 Minutes. They know you from obviously Fox and various things in between, but fill in the blanks for everybody for them to understand the magnitude of your media experience.
Well, a lot of people don't really know that I started out as a print journalist, you know, and then I was doing radio journalism for a significant period of time too, primarily for CBS radio. And that was phenomenal because it reached so many people. But I was, and then I went into television. You know, people sort of assume that I followed the path of wanting to be famous, but actually I followed the path of wanting to be a real journalist. And it's funny because people, I'm sure they do it to you too in your business. You know, people come to you and saying like, how can I do what you're doing? In other words, how can I become you? And it's like, you're starting with the wrong question, right? Yeah. Because certainly my career path hasn't been built on fame and glory. It's been built on hard work and a real commitment to figuring out the truth. And I've not really thought beyond that. And fortunately for me, you know, I was born and raised in a country at a time of dramatic transition, which was South Africa at the end of apartheid, when, you know, and so when I started out as a journalist, I had one of the biggest stories of the world that was right in my backyard. Now, that was the plus side. The negative side was that nobody wanted to send a little white girl into townships that were literally on fire, where people were being hacked to death every day, right, in numbers. So I had to sneak in. I had to find my way in. I had to make friendships and alliances.
How old were you at this time?
17.
17. I mean, that is... Yeah. I mean, nobody wanted to send people in, but I would be willing to bet there were very few 17-year-old women that wanted to actually go there on their own, regardless of being sent.
I never met any.
Yes.
I never met any, but you know what I would do?
Did you know that Leading Giants has over 120 micro-learning modules from 4 to 19 minutes on entrepreneurship, communication, anything to maximize your influence? We are here to help you build the life of your dreams by maximizing your influence, growing a company, leading people at levels you've never led before. If you're in sales, having a greater opportunity for increased closing percentages and larger activity than you've ever had before. It's time now for you to jump in and join Leading Giants. All you have to do is press that button right down there. In order to access this, share with your friends, become a giant. We'll go slay some dragons.
So the stills photographers, you know, the photographer is always great to learn from because They have to be there to get the picture. And in those days, this is how old I am, right, Dave? Because I'm 52 now. But in those days, you know, they would actually have to develop their pictures, right? And go through all of them and select the ones that would be in the paper. So all those that were rejected, you know, they would discard them, and I would crawl underneath the photographer's desks after they left at night. And I would go through, and I made albums really of my own record of the violence in the townships in South Africa. And another thing I would do is I really got my opportunity by volunteering for every, I don't know if you can say shitty on your podcast, but let's just say on every, every shitty job that no other journalist wanted to do at the paper, I held up my hand and volunteered for that. So one of those was that I worked at a Sunday newspaper when I was still in my final year of high school. And on a Saturday night, one journalist had to stay and wait for the first edition of the paper to come out, and then go to the fire station, the police station, the hospital, and the morgue, and give free copies of the paper, because that was your currency. There's no internet in those days, right? Right. And what you would do then, that was an opportunity for me to build relationships. So at the time, there was a lot of violence in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela's party was saying that it was blaming it on the government and shadowy third force. And of course, the government was saying, oh, look at Black people in South Africa. They're too busy fighting each other. They couldn't possibly lead a country, and, all this nonsense. And so it was, the bodies would disappear overnight before you could, as journalists, could get out there on the streets and try to figure out how many people died and what happened. So what did I do to get around that? I made friends with the guy at the morgue. Because he got the bodies, right? And when the police picked them up, they had to go somewhere. And so he would let me in and let me look at them and count them. And I could see if they were shot or hacked to death or burned alive or whatever. And so that's how I learned the importance of building relationships in journalism and seeing things for yourself, and that unshakable firsthand knowledge that you gain that no one can take from you, which is what I think, after many years on the battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq and working in Syria, before the big war, during the war in Iraq, I was in Syria, and in many, many, many other places, Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, just dozens and dozens of countries all over the world. When I finally was forced by life to, come and base myself in the US, which was really kind of torture for me. I had to sort of give up on the breaking news, crazy lifestyle in order to have a family and to raise my children and to be, a good mom who was there and present in their lives. So when I had to give that up and transition more into the long form at 60 minutes, that was really difficult. For me, that was really hard. But I had something that I have noticed that journalists who didn't get out in the field, so even journalists who are very accomplished and have a huge body of work, maybe you're the Pentagon correspondent. If you've only ever been on congressional delegations and you've never really spent time abroad and you've never lived in those places, at 19, I was sleeping on the streets of Angola with street children during the war there to understand what it was like. I couldn't tear myself away. The kids didn't want me to leave. And, so inadvertently, I got this experience and insight and real understanding. So when people told me things about those kids, when people said like street kids don't come from good families, I knew that wasn't true because I slept on the streets with those kids, even though it was for a moment. And so I think that kind of knowledge really helped me stay the course when I moved to the U.S. Because when somebody from a U.S. think tank or from the Pentagon or the National Security Council or the White House tells you that, oh, well, Afghans, Afghanistan should never have been a country. Afghans really don't have a sense of national identity because they're tribal. It's like, what are you talking about? You can't, I spent years in Afghanistan. And if there's one thing I know, you can have complete and utter loyalty to your tribe and to your country. There's no conflict for them. And so this idea that you have to choose is utter nonsense. This is the political, BS, basically, that gets spewed and proliferated around Washington, and think tanks write papers about it, and they all pat each other on the back and they push it out on the evening news, and they all tell themselves they're so knowledgeable, and they can, sure, they might be able to quote from history because they read a lot of books, but they never, ever listened.
Yeah. There's no doubt about it. Something that always interjects is our bias. And we can have an innocent bias, meaning that we have inclinations to like or dislike certain groups. But there's also like this cunning intellectual dishonesty that takes place where a person's like, yes, not only am I biased, but I'm literally willing to lie about my bias, as opposed to a person who doesn't really think they're lying about their bias. They just maybe want to believe it. How do you recognize that in others, and how do you keep yours in check?
So we had this amazing producer at 60 Minutes who was very well known for his profile pieces on really famous people, which is an art in itself. And he did a piece on Melissa Etheridge. And this was a long time back, right, when she really first became famous. And one of the things my boss said when the lights came on is he said, you just breeze through the fact that we have two lesbians who have adopted children and they're raising children as if that's completely and utterly normal. And everybody does it. And that's your own bias. There are plenty of people in our audience who don't see it that way. There are people who do and there are people who don't. But you can't assume these things. And that, for me, is a great example of the implicit bias embedded within legacy and mainstream media, whatever you want to call it. Because we're surrounded by people that share so many of those ideals. And if there is someone who's conservative, I mean, Lord above, they're not going to say it, right? They're not going to admit to it because they'll be an outcast in the newsroom. So whether it's the fact that you think that all pro-life people are, nutters who blow up abortion clinics, or every Trump supporter is a racist, or everyone living in small town America or in flyover countries completely and utterly worthless and shouldn't be given the right to vote because when they do, they do crazy things like pick people like Donald Trump, right? And so all of those things are so built into the culture of media in this country. And those are the things that are rewarded. You are not rewarded for going against the narrative. You are not rewarded for owning your own bias.
Yeah, and I think this is the part that really matters. When we talk about becoming a giant, one of the most central things to do is to have humility. And humility is precision truth about yourself, right?
Yes.
You can't possibly report on anything if you are ignorant of the fact that you have a bias.
Correct.
The only way that you can actually provide the truth of what you're seeing is to say, where might I be influencing this according to my bias? And to be able to say, hey, my job here, by the way, there is commentary. If somebody's saying, listen, I'm doing commentary, I'm giving you my bias.
Opinion.
Go for it. Right.
Yeah.
This is my opinion. There's a place for that and a time for that. But when you're doing a story to take and basically bring people into the view of what actually took place, you have to put that aside, and you can't do it if you don't know it. And I have seen that too. I have seen a really, there's that classic saying, if you were born and raised in an insane asylum, would you even know you're insane? Mm-hmm. And if you are just constantly as a vacuum of the same people that think exactly the same way, and you don't know there's something outside of it, you can't recognize that bias. Thinking about that, one of the things that we always talk to people about that have taken careers to the highest level, no matter what it is, and you clearly have done that, is to say, okay, and you told the story of being 17. I mean, basically what you were doing at 17, most people would have been happy to do at the peak of their career. So you were ahead of the curve. But I always ask people, if you knew then what you know now, mm-hmm. what would you say to yourself? If you went and you sat down and talked to that 17-year-old and you said, here's some things that I learned. If I would have known at your age what I know now, here's my advice to you. What would you say that is?
Wow. That's very, very interesting. So what's curious for me is that I have always been blessed with the certainty of knowing who I am and what I stand for, what I believe in. And I was also blessed with a very wise mother, right? Who used to say things to me like, wow, you're so young and yet you know everything. It must be wonderful. I'm so old and I know so little. In comparison, it's just incredible, with of course, without a hint of irony, right? Or who died and made you the oracle and the miracle, right? Because when you're young, you think you know everything. And I think that the two most significant things that I have learned along the way are, number one, even though I was always a humble person, I've still been humbled. Even when you think you're humble, when you come from, Western civilization, in a society where you've been able to work and be rewarded, and you've been able to improve your life, and you've had opportunity, you really cannot understand what it is like to work hard all your life and never have opportunity. So as humble as you think you are when you're young, life will show you new levels of humility. It really will. And when you think you've got things figured out, you can be 100% certain you don't, right? And you will learn that over time, and you can only learn that the hard way, I think. Nobody can teach you that. It's just like you can intellectually, you can understand it, but you can't really and truly understand it until you've lived it. So that's one thing that I would say to people. If I could have been more conscious of what I didn't know. I mean, I understood that I didn't know things. I wasn't afraid to acknowledge that, but I really didn't account for the unknowable. I didn't factor that into the equation, and I should have. Well, I would have been better. I would have been better at my job if I had. The other thing that I would say is that I did not understand the role that God was playing in every part of my life. I thought I walked alone.
That a little bit.
Yeah, I thought I walked alone, and I was wrong.
Yeah, that awareness is a really interesting one, because it provides two different things, I think. One is it provides a certain sense of peace and calm. But at the same time, too, there's a certain sense of mystery. Like, how much greater can this life be, and how much more can I actually do because I was created for something huge and amazing. And it makes sense of suffering, too. You've gone through a lot of challenges. I mean, even when you said there are some people that will work their entire life without opportunity, and you have to visit a lot of different countries to see that, where there are some people where you say, you know what, if you were born in America and you had that same attitude and that same work ethic, you would have become something incredible. And if you'd have taken somebody from America and moved them here who did accomplish something, they would be right where you are. We have a tendency to believe that there are certain things in our lives that we have ownership over. But I remember even Warren Buffett once saying, somebody asked him about his success, and among other things, because he's practical, he said, I'm lucky. And that's offensive to your modern grind it and you can accomplish all things type of person. But there's a certain amount of luck in there. What are some of the stories that you've seen when you've been in some of these countries that kind of rip your heart out? And how do you kind of reconcile that in your own world to be able to just kind of forge on doing the work that you do?
It's funny what you say about luck, right? Because we used to have this conversation all the time in my team at 60 Minutes, because we went to, we were in Iraq and Afghanistan and the battlefield, and we didn't just go as tourists and camp out in a hotel. We got right to the heart of the fight, right? So we were in a lot of very dangerous situations. And I always used to say to people, well, you try to make the best decisions and you do this and that, but you also, and then, you get lucky. And one of the greatest journalists I ever worked with, who was a producer and cameraman and a great field producer, always used to say to me, I find the smarter I am, the luckier I get. Yep. Which always made me laugh. And I gotta say, for me, I can't speak for other people, but for me, the luck that I have had, I really put down to the angels on my shoulder. I mean, God gave me opportunities along the way to make decisions for the right reasons. and I feel that I was rewarded with protection. You know, like, for example, when I was living with the Afghan soldiers on the front line in the Afghan war, before the U.S. had even landed or let their presence be known, put it that way. There were small teams operating on the ground, but not the big presence, right? And at that time, I was living with an Afghan general, and he would meet regularly with Taliban commanders who would drive out of Kabul at night to escape the bombings, leave their people to get bombed, of course, and then come and make their deals with people who, you know, although they were on the other side, they'd known many of these people all their lives. And so that was their way out, right, was to cut a deal. And I was part of all of these meetings, night after night after night. And every night, the general would say to me, "You want to go to Kabul? Like, you can go." And I looked at that and I realized, what is my editorial contribution to the story? Like, that's what would justify this decision. It was never a stunt for me. It was never about headlines. It was never about, oh, Lara Logan goes into Kabul. You know what I mean? I looked at it, and there was a BBC journalist, Raghi Omar, and there was one other journalist who were in Kabul. So we were still getting news and reports, very good reporting on the ground in Kabul. So I couldn't justify that risk. I couldn't say that journalistically it's worth it to get in the car with a bunch of Taliban, none of whom speak English, who are, you know, they owned 80%, 90% of the country at that point, right? Women were executed in the stadiums en masse just for showing a sliver of flesh, right? This is a very, very dangerous time and a very powerful enemy. And so in order to justify taking a risk like that, my consideration was purely editorial. I didn't put fame or any of those other things. So I believe that, you know, when faced with those critical decisions, if you're motivated by the right things, you exponentially increase your chances of surviving this, because what you're doing has the hand of God on it. When you do things, you know, out of greed and you know, and other motives that I wouldn't consider particularly noble, I think that you start to increase your chances of bad luck catching up with you, because, you know, and I would also say that, you know, in terms of, you know, what are some of the things that I have seen and how I've dealt with that, this is really an extraordinary thing that God has done with me, because people all the time at various stages of my career, particularly when I was, you know, causing trouble, right, would try to imply or infer.
Wait. When were you not causing trouble?
Okay, so for many occasions in my career, people have tried to suggest that, oh, well, you know, you must have PTSD, or you must need to see a therapist, or you need counseling. You've been through so much. You know, I've seen people dead. I've seen people dying. I've seen horrific things, right? And and yet somehow I am completely intact. And that is not because I don't feel that pain. It's not because I haven't cried. I mean, I have cried. I have given every part of my heart, body, and soul to the people whose stories I've told, to the places that I've been. I mean, it's a gift. What I've been able to do, and what I have been able to do with that, right? And the places that I have gone, and what I have been able to take with me, has truly been a gift. And I have given everything I am in return. And so somehow in that process, I am completely at peace. And so even when I was gang raped, you know, and sodomized and beaten almost to death in Egypt, you know, I never had one single moment of anger. Not one. I understood perfectly and completely that God had given me the chance to still be a mother to my children, who were 1 and 2, maybe even 10 months actually in 1 at the time, and that I had a chance to live, right? When I had been so close to death, death had me in its clutches. That's where I was. I had reluctantly resigned myself to a filthy, horrible, nasty death with nothing in it that would be written about or remembered. You know, it had nothing of merit in it. It was just a worthless, meaningless, filthy death. And I had I had accepted that reality because it was so close. And yet God brought me back from that. And I never wanted to waste a single second being bitter or being angry, or to not take that and run with it and give it everything possible that I had. And then I learned such an important lesson from a South African woman who went through a terrible ordeal. And at the trial of the men who raped her and slit her stomach open and cut her throat and, did terrible things to her. At their trial, when the judge asked her, how are you able to be so brave, so strong? And she looked at him and she said, they took so much from me that night. Why would I give them the rest of my life as well? And that's something I have never forgotten. I was maybe 23 at the time. I was well, it was early 40, I think, when I almost died in Egypt. And so I carried that with me all those years. And Dave, I know your faith is very strong. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear people talk about faith. I don't care anymore, because what I came to realize in my life was that at every step along the way, these things wove together to form a perfect curve, of my life. And that has been incredibly difficult at times. It's still difficult, when you're an outlier and you're fighting, the most powerful people in this country, and the entire society is designed, to work against that. Right? They don't want independence. They don't want the truth, regardless of who it affects. When we are in a tidal wave that's moving towards censorship and oppression and false narratives over truth and, all these things. When you're fighting that every single day, it's exhausting. But it's also, every minute of my life, I know, has meant something. And that in itself, is not given to everybody.
Hey there, Giant. Dave Durand here, and I want to invite you to subscribe to our brand new e-newsletter, where you will get the best of the best tips and insights to unlock the giant in you, build an empire, and slay some dragons. Sign up below. Let's go slay some dragons. And you have been remarkable in this. I mean, this last, 5 minutes worth of this segment is, the type of it could be a healing ministry for so many different people who've gone through things. And I think some of these takeaways, first of all, one of the takeaways is, I don't know how you did what you did. And I must just kind of put that out there. If I did have to say, these are the observations that I've made about how you did that. I think one of the gifts you have is that you are not shocked by anything. You've seen so much evil that you just aren't shocked by human nature. But one of the things that's remarkable, though, is how you would integrate the lessons you've learned from other people into your own life to empower yourself. Most people, they don't do that. They have admiration for the woman you said who the judge asked that question, how does she have the strength? They have admiration for these people who've overcome things, and they are not shocked by evil that happens to other people. But when it becomes to them, all of a sudden now, they can't take it. You've integrated those things in a remarkable way. I have so much respect for you for being able to do that. And you have been able to just kind of forge on and move forward. I guess from kind of a leadership perspective, or the perspective of helping other people who are trying to meander through their career, especially after hearing what they just heard. There's a lot of people who say, I was fired, I just don't know how I'm going to recover. Okay, well, did you hear what Lara's gone through? And you're talking about being fired? I'm sorry. That's nothing compared to the challenges you've faced. What would you say are, if you had to summarize, and you kind of did this, but if you had to just kind of put this in a fine point, if shit has hit the fan, these are absolute things that you need to do to get self-agency again, what would they be?
I think it's very simple, actually. It's, the great thing about it is that it doesn't change. It's probably exactly the same things that people have always needed to do. You have to know yourself, right? I mean, for me, I was told a long time ago that most people lie to themselves. And most people are, are moral cowards. And if you start from that position and you don't expect of them what you expect of yourself, you won't spend your whole life being disappointed. So those were things that I never wanted to be, right? When I heard those things, I was like, oh, like, okay, I don't want to be that. And so part of that was always trying to live a good life. I am a person with a very big heart and a very soft heart. And I can't bear injustice, and I can't bear unkindness, and I can't stand disrespect and prejudice and that kind of thing. Like, that has never sat well with me. I've had and I just think I'm very, fortunate in a sense, because there's absolute moral clarity there, right? There's no gray area. And I think a lot of people find comfort in the gray. Maybe I'm just lucky that I've instinctively stepped away from that. I understand and recognize the gray, but I know that, when it comes to, for example, principles, you can't be iffy, right? You've got to be consistent. And consistency is one of these truly underrated virtues in people. So, I always say to people, if they say, well, you're a this or you're a that, I say, at least you always know what you're going to get. It's never going to change, right? And so I think, I've been given a lot of advantages in terms of figuring out who I am. I've been loved all my life. I've been surrounded by great people. I had I have a wonderful family. I lost my mother, who was an extraordinary woman. I've lost my father. And my parents were divorced. I didn't have some sort of idyllic childhood or anything like that. But I really have had, and I learned, of course, from people like Nelson Mandela. I was lucky enough to grow up, in a time where men like that rose to honestly to shine a light for all of us. And there were many people in Mandela's image on the streets of South Africa and in the townships, extraordinary people that did amazing things for what they believed in. Archbishop Desmond Tutu is a more famous one, who's one of my favorites, but there were others, right? Names that were never famous, names that were never known of. People that would, like, for example, the ANC had a strategy where they would take a group of young people who would give up their whole lives, and all they did was travel from school to school to school, all over the country, running from the secret police and others, and they would bring a message from Comrade Nelson Mandela. Right. And they would go to the principal of the school and say, we have a message. Can we deliver it? And if the principal said yes, they would do that. And if the principal said no, they would separate and run to the classrooms and deliver the message and run for their lives before they could be caught. And so, these are the kind of amazing people that I have been fortunate enough to know firsthand. And so for me, I really think it comes down to being honest with yourself, knowing who you are, and being willing to stand up for principle no matter what. A friend of mine said to me once that principles are just bumper stickers if you don't stand up for them when it counts most, right? And so those, some people don't know those things, that they weren't born knowing those things. I was born knowing those things. I have had moments along the way. I had a moment when I went into the NGO world, and I quickly realized that, this was the one moment I thought journalism might not be for me, and I was absolutely wrong, right? So I was lucky. I had that sense of purpose from the very beginning. I don't know really what to say to people who don't know their purpose, except that in your journey of figuring out who you are and what you were born for, there will be things all along the way that tell you the answers. And it's up to you to have an open mind and an open heart and not be blinded to those things. And I think that's where greed and the wrong motivations can blind you to what those things are. And that's why maybe some people get to the point where they're very successful and they're very wealthy, but they're not really fulfilled, Mm-hmm. And you can meet other people who have much less, but they are very fulfilled.
You are predisposed, by the way, from, know yourself, right? Don't be a moral coward. all these things predispose you to ultimately say, at some point, I know that God is in my life. But you know what I want to talk about now is you are a great communicator. You are a fantastic storyteller. So we kind of moved from what your career was to some of the challenges you've overcome and all these things that are super inspirational for people to like your craft. And I know that if somebody wants to be a giant and they want to lead giants, they effectively communicate. They have to be able to tell the story in order to move the heart, not just the mind. So if you were to give the short course to our audience about how to influence people with language and story, what would you say are the key components that you've learned throughout your life? Besides being obviously naturally gifted in this, you've crafted this, you've worked on it.
You know, this will probably surprise some people listening to this. So the thing for me is that at the heart of everything I have ever done is integrity. I have never, ever said, I'm one of those people that says, you know, I'm a really good guy. Oh, but at work, I'm a real asshole, right? Or when I'm, you know, if I'm vying with someone for a story, you know, or for an interview or whatever, when in the competition, I can be this person, but then I can tell myself that I'm actually really not that person, right? That's not really me. That's just what I do in order to succeed because this is what's required in my world. I think that's where the rubber really meets the road for me, is that I believe great storytelling begins with integrity and honesty. I mean, that's what I bring to the people whose stories I tell. Like all I can tell them is that I am never going to lie to you. I am never going to deceive you. I am never going to violate this sacred trust. And even if it's somebody, where you're doing a really controversial interview or a really confrontational interview, you might not say to them, well, this is all I want to talk about. But I always told my team, never lie. Right? You don't have to make that the focus of the pitch or the request or whatever, but you have to be honest that we want to address these issues. And that has really stood me in great stead. And now over time, as what has happened is on the one hand, I have earned the respect and the trust of a lot of people. There's other people who don't, like me, and it's been a lot of people have attempted to discredit me. So some people think, oh, she's gone from great journalist to conspiracy theorist, but they can't make that stick because it's just not true. And then on the other hand, what has happened at the same time is that they have seen the lack of people who do that. Right? There's, on the one hand, I'm getting people coming to me, wanting me to tell their stories and to share things with me, and people who've never spoken or would never consider speaking to a journalist, who are now driven by the circumstances of the time to get their stories out. And on the one hand, it's because, I can be trusted and I've earned their respect. But on the other hand, it's because there's so few, because so many journalists are not doing their job. Because there's so few news programs and media institutions that still offer that to people. I mean, honestly, I would sit down with anybody, even if it was somebody, even if it was Hunter Biden, for example, somebody who I don't have a lot of respect and regard for at this point. If I sat down with Hunter Biden, yes, I would do a tough interview, but I would be honest, I would be fair, I would listen. And I think that this is an imperceptible thing. People want the tools of the trade. You want me to give you the cheat sheet? I'm doing a great interview. I'll give you one of the best pieces of advice I ever got from my boss. And he said to me once, how many Ed Bradley scripts have you read? How many, Morley Safer scripts have you read? How many Mike Wallace scripts have you read? We talked about scripts. And he said, the reason I'm asking you this is that everybody has their own style, right? When Leslie Stoll does an interview, it's when she sits down with someone and asks a question, you are in no doubt where she stands. You can tell from her tone, the way she approaches the question, the language she uses and everything, exactly where she stands. He said, or you've got somebody like an Ed Bradley who can literally ask anybody anything, and you will be listening for the answer. And you'll have no idea where he's really coming from. And he said, you need to decide, who are you and what is your style? What is the natural fit for you? And I knew instantly, right? No shadow of a doubt. I'm the Ed Bradley model, right? I don't want people to pick a side before they've heard the answer. I want to create a space where people can hear, anyone can hear that answer. So, for example, I used to drive my crew nuts because we spent many years, many trips to Afghanistan. And one of the things I would do at the end of almost every interview, sometimes on camera, sometimes not, is I would say, "So tell me, sir, do you beat your wife?" And do you see what I'm doing there, Dave? Is like, I am not saying to you, "Oh, do you beat your wife?" 80% of the men in this country, according to the Secretary of Women's Affairs. You know what I mean? I'm not doing that. I'm asking you, do you beat your wife? And I'm giving you the opportunity to answer that question. And, most of the time that wasn't part of our story. And, but I can literally sit down in front of anyone. I sat down in front of one of the most prolific killers in Iraq, the leader of the Badr Corps, Hadi al-Amri, who was trained and backed 100% by Iran and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. I asked him about the fact that he was personally responsible. According to a U.S. Embassy cable that I'd gotten my hands on, I said to him, "You, sir, according to the U.S. ambassador in this cable sent to Washington on this date, you are personally responsible for the deaths of up to 3,000, at least 3,000 Sunnis. And your preferred method of killing them is to drill holes in their heads while they're still alive. Is that true?" And he looked at me and he said, "There's no evidence of this. I already told General Petraeus, I told General Corelli, he went through all the generals. I told them all, there's no evidence of this." And I looked at him and I said, "There's no evidence, but is it true? Did you do it?" And he gave me a death stare that chilled my bones. And he looked me straight in the eyes and he said, "I wouldn't hurt a fly."
Watch the extended version of this interview exclusively on leadinggiants.com to take a deeper dive into business strategies and secrets to becoming a high-value, maximum influence giant so you can go slay some dragons.
Yeah. And then I got up and I passed out on a chair because I was so sick. I'd just done 3.5 hours of editing, and he took my team apart. His people took them into separate rooms. He interrogated them. He threatened us. I mean, we ended up having to, make secret copies of the material and hide it. He tortured our local Iraqi teammates, and colleagues. I mean, they went after them. They canceled our access to the battlefield. They did everything to try to keep that interview suppressed. And they never managed. And, but that's the kind of thing, like, I really did listen to his answers, but I had spent years covering the murders that he was responsible for. I knew he'd done it. I'd seen some of the bodies. I had talked to some of the children. I'll never forget one little boy who, when his men came to take his father in the middle of the night, and his father was barefoot because they dragged him out of bed, and he ran after them. And he said to his father, "Dad, like, here, take your slippers." He had his slippers in his hand. And one of the militia members taking him out turned and held the boy. And he said, "He's not going to need those where he's going." And the next day he turned up in a huge dumpster, just not far actually from our office, at a hotel on the side of the river in Baghdad, and in a dumpster with a whole bunch of other bodies. So these are things like I already knew that answer, but I wanted to give him the space and the time. And then the other thing I learned in terms of tradecraft is always to pay attention. A lot of people are not listening when they're doing an interview, and they don't have the right follow-up question. And asking someone a great question and letting them get away with not answering it makes you a bad interviewer. It's frustrating for the viewer.
By the way, it makes you a bad leader. I see people. I see people ask questions like that. They, in a business meeting, so tell me what was the report last week and how does it affect this week's projections? And then,
yes.
Yeah, it was pretty good, but don't worry about it. And then the leader just moves on. I'm like, how in the world can you make a decision that way? You have to know the answer, and you have to be able to know when a person is giving you a non-answer answer. I mean, it goes back to,
That's right.
It goes back to stripes. Have you ever been convicted of a crime? Convicted?
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of that same sort of thing. But gosh, what your
it's exactly that thing. Let me just tell you this. That's why I had the nickname, my crews, my team would nickname me the follow-up honey badger, because it's the follow-up question where you really kind of pin them to the wall. And so when we had particularly challenged, not all your interviews are like that, right? When you're interviewing someone, whose child has just died or whatever it is, you're not pinning them to the wall. But if you're sitting down with the commanding general of Afghan forces, you can't just let him walk all over you. You need him to answer those questions. So you try to anticipate what those answers will be and think of how you would counter the different possibilities, right? So there's at least some planning and forethought that goes into it. I have built up, a significant body of knowledge over the years. And so I like to have it all in my head. I don't like to look at a piece of paper. I think when someone's talking to you, it's kind of rude to be reading something that you've written. So you're trying to figure out what you're going to say next. When I sit down in front of them, just like Ed Bradley used to say, you get.
Gosh, I made that mistake. Well, for the record, I made that mistake twice while I'm interviewing Lara, and she's giving a short course on how to be a great interviewer. So, Nico, you're gonna have to take these notes when she's like, and just cut that part out so I look better.
You're funny. It's not like you're sitting there the whole time just reading your notes and not paying attention,
No, but I do feel like I'm in class. I've got to get this right. Here I'm asking her how to do great interviews. When I'm interviewing her, I probably should have done this before the show and then just, done everything she said before I go into this. So, it's fascinating about this.
Dave, the way I would sometimes cheat is if you have to break, which, to change a battery, or you have to break because somebody, someone's camera's gone down or whatever, then I might look at the page. But most of the time, it's like, I try to have encyclopedic knowledge in my head. I've done 4 or 5 hour interviews without a single note. Regularly.
Yeah, and that's two things. That's a combination of a natural gift that God gave you because he knew this is what he wanted you to do, and then secondly, you developing it. But what's fascinating about this is that, when we're talking about this, how to tell a story, how to interview somebody effectively, how to ask questions effectively, most people are talking to Bob from accounting about last week's, financial statement. And you're talking to some killer who drills somebody in the head and that your life could be threatened in the middle of it. There are a lot of people who don't have the courage to ask questions in a basic marketing meeting. And yet you had the nerve to ask and the courage to ask these questions. What would you say to somebody about this? I mean, how do you strengthen yourself to do this?
You know what it is, Dave? It's because I never think about nerve. I never think about it in those terms. It is purely defined for me by responsibility. Like, I figure if I am in this position right now, I have a responsibility to do my job to the best of my ability. Like, my audience, why should they tune in to watch my story or my show if I'm not going to deliver something that's worthwhile? And so it's like, I look at it more in terms of, if I fail to do this, if I fail to ask the right questions and follow up and hold, and make sure that somebody's answering, or if they're not answering, that it's very clear to everyone that they're not, I owe it to the people whose stories I have undertaken to tell, right? That I challenge them, because a lot of people are afraid of being challenged. You do a profile at 60 Minutes, like Morley Safer did once, on a great artist. And this artist, they painted him out. He was so talented. And, you really kind of, as you went into the piece, they really drew you in. You were impressed by what he'd done and so on, and you were learning about him. And then Morley Safer challenged him with what his critics said about his work. And the man came apart. And I was done, right? I was like, oh, what a shame. This guy is, he's small, right? And he's arrogant. and he's incapable of handling this. That's pathetic. Whereas contrast that with I'm doing a story about Robert Ballard, and he's the guy who found the Titanic, right? He found the PT-109 and the Bismarck, all these. He's the greatest undersea explorer in history. So I'm not going to just do some sycophantic piece, because there's nothing really challenging or interesting in that. I mean, it's great for a moment, but it lives and dies. It just passes you by because it doesn't have any substance. So what did I say to Ballard? I said to him, your critics say that you're full of it, right? You're conceited and you're a showman, and it's all about you. And he looked at me and he said, well, of course I am. Absolutely. I am totally a showman. He said, do you think I can walk into somebody's office and say, I really suck at this. Give me $4 million. No.
That's great. How bold.
I mean, in that moment, you fell in love with Bob Ballard. You fell in love with the man because he was brave, he was honest, he was funny, he was self-deprecating, but he also pointed out, like, come on, I've got to sell this. If I don't sell it, who's going to back me? This is expensive and it's dangerous, right? And it might fail. There's a good chance of failure. All these other people try to find the Titanic, they failed. You know what I mean? So those are the moments. What I try to do with people who I am interviewing, I really try to get them not to be afraid of being challenged. Or if there's something like with Bruno Mars, right? When I was with Bruno Mars, he had a drug charge. Now, I didn't want Bruno to shut down. I didn't want him to hear the standard question about the drug charge and to stop listening to me and trusting me. So, I built that rapport with him. I built that trust with him where he could see that this person they are who they say they are. What you see is what you get. There's no agenda here. I'm honorable in all the negotiations and in everything that we do. You keep your word, you're honorable, you show who you're made of and that you have integrity. And so then you have that conversation with them and you say, listen, I want to talk about the drug charge, but I don't want to do it just because it's the thing to ask about. I want to learn something from it. And I want you to not run from that, because this is something that as a responsible journalist, it has to be addressed. It's part of your story. It's a big part. It's a negative part in some, as people regard it. But I don't know if it's really negative for you. And so I want to let you know that, this is one of the areas we'll touch upon, right? And so when I asked Bruno Mars about that question, actually what you learned from him was that is the reason, that moment was the reason he wasn't a drug addict. That moment was the reason Bruno Mars doesn't party, like a rock star, right? He's not about, that was a moment where he was at a crossroads. He could choose. What was his path going to be? Was he going to go the path of many greats that came before him and do the drugs and alcohol and the wildlife and, and all the rest of it? Or was he going to make a different decision about who he was as a person? And he really did. Bruno Mars confronted who he was in that moment and he said, I don't like that person. I don't respect that person. I never want to be here ever again. And I'm never going to be. And what's extraordinary about Bruno Mars is that, people don't know that about him. They don't really know that you have a guy here of such profound integrity and principle with such a huge heart. And where is that reflected? It's not just some BS he fed me. When you're smart and you look at this, right, you see that reflected in the fact that he has the same band members. I don't know now because it's some years on, but at that time, he'd gone from nothing to extraordinary success. And he had kept his same team around him. And not only that, when I spoke to those guys, a lot of it off the record or in, informal moments, right? They adored him. And not just that, but they respected him. And they were a real, even the ones, there was his brother was his drummer, and he had his best friends from the hood growing up. These are the things that really are part of what makes Bruno Mars, what sets him apart from the others. There are other talented musicians out there, but there's very few that have the soul and the heart and the moral courage of a Bruno Mars, who really knows who he is.
Yeah, and you brought that out by asking the question the right way. You know, this is the type of thing where you know when conflict is necessary, and you also know when you could have conflict that is unnecessary and unproductive, and being able to use that kind of intuition, put your, you know, your subject at ease. That's a very, very impressive thing. Well, I got to tell you, we are at the end of our hour, but you know, my secret is here. My secret is this. My secret is, if you want to run a great interview and you're going to interview one of the best interviewers ever, it's going to be easy, because I could come into this totally unprepared and say, Lara, we've got an hour, go. And you're going to be able to tell everybody they need to know, and you're going to be able to make it easy on me. And you have done that. This was a short course on many different things. It was a short course on courage. It was a short course on the ability to communicate effectively with people. It was a short course on forgiveness, a short course on honesty, a short course on truth, a short course on how to be, bold in the face of people who are running against that. And I'm just really grateful that you were on the show too. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to be inspired by this. I know that I have. I look forward to, continuing to watch your work and being a part of it too. Maybe have a glass of wine with some of the gang there back in Texas as well too. So thanks so much, Lara, for being on. Any last comments you'd want to share with the audience?
Yes, I want to say that this was a really easy one for me when you reached out to do this interview, because I'm sure your audience already knows this, but I have to say it for me. You know, you are truly a man of your word, and you're a very impressive man. Everything about you live everything that you preach and talk about. And so not only have you been able to be very successful in your life, but you have always wanted to share that. You have always wanted to give other people some of what God gave you. And there aren't enough people who are truly people of their word, right? You have put faith in me from the first moment that we met, and you are also brutally honest. And I had so much respect from you from our very first lunch together. And you also you took the time and the trouble, and you flew out. You didn't have to do any of those things. And so when you're sharing for people, with people, what makes a giant, you are a giant in what you have done. And sometimes when I look at what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, I do think about you and the discipline that you bring to what you do, and the efficiency and things like that. So I'm really glad that you're doing this, because you are one of the few people who has been truly successful and yet is truly certain of who they are, and wants to share that with others very generously, by the way. You have an incredibly generous spirit, and you're a great dad. And I don't know if people know all those things about you, but you are one of the people I really do respect. So I am very glad to be able to have this conversation with you. I knew it would be a meaningful conversation, because that's who you are. And I know your show is going to be successful because everything you do is successful.
You're so kind. I am, the respect is mutual. I really appreciate everything, Lara, and being on, and our friendship. And I really look forward to being in touch. And thanks for everything you've done for everybody here who's going to watch Durand on Demand and Leading Giant.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Hey there, Giant. Thanks for watching Durand on Demand. I need your help with something. The world desperately needs more giants. You know it, and I know it. We've been around a lot of people struggling, figuring out how to make things go. So hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, share this with as many people as you can. We're going to build this audience, and we're going to help people slay dragons together.